What if the greatest financial crash in history wasn't a surprise? What if the warnings were flashing red, clear as day, for years? What if the people who saw it coming stood up and screamed, but their warnings were drowned out by the roar of the party? The truth about October 1929 is stranger and more terrifying than most people realize. The crash wasn't a sudden catastrophe that emerged from nowhere. It was a disaster that was telegraphed. It was a 10-year countdown, a trap set in plain sight. And the most terrifying part? Almost everyone, from the shoeshine boy to the nation's top bankers, willingly walked right into it. This is the story of how an entire nation bet everything on the idea that reality had changed forever, and how reality always collects on that bet. To understand the crash, you first have to understand the party. The 1920s were America's great intoxication, and the intoxication ran deep. After World War I, which had ravaged Europe and left the continent exhausted, America stood relatively untouched. The infrastructure was intact. The factories were humming. There was genuine wealth being created. Manufacturing boomed. The economy hummed with real productivity. There was money everywhere. Or at least it felt that way. People had just lived through the misery of wartime and a devastating pandemic. Now the party was on. Jazz filled speakeasies. Women wore shorter dresses. Cars rolled off assembly lines in Detroit at staggering rates. People who had never owned a car suddenly could. Henry Ford had figured out mass production, and it changed everything. The prices of automobiles dropped. Suddenly, the American dream wasn't just about owning a home anymore. It was about owning a car, a radio, a washing machine. It was about consumption, rising living standards, and the unshakable belief that the future would be even better than the present. This wasn't a hallucination. Real things were being built. Real productivity was increasing. Real wages were going up for many workers. But underneath the genuine growth, something else was growing too. Something far bigger and far more dangerous. Speculation. Pure, naked, irrational speculation. And by the late 1920s, the speculation had absolutely dwarfed the underlying reality. It had become so enormous that it became the only story that mattered. The stock market became the center of this national mania. In 1920, fewer than 3 million Americans owned stocks. By 1929, that number had swelled to around 10 million. The market seemed to only move in one direction, up, always up. When everyone believes that, when the belief becomes so total that doubt itself seems foolish, that's when the system begins to crack from the inside. But how? How did millions of ordinary people, tailors in Brooklyn, secretaries in Chicago, elevator operators in Manhattan, suddenly get the financial leverage of billionaires? The answer was a terrifyingly simple trap, and it had a name. They called it margin buying. Here is the key detail, the detail that matters. Most of those 10 million Americans weren't buying stocks with their actual money. They were buying them with borrowed money. The mechanism was elegant and terrifying in its simplicity. You could walk into a brokerage office with $1,000 in your pocket and buy $10,000 worth of stock. The broker would loan you the rest. You put down 10%. The broker covers 90%. As long as the stock price went up, this worked perfectly. You'd sell the stock at a profit, pay back the loan, and keep the difference. It was free money. Except it wasn't. It was a trap that had been set a decade earlier, and it was finally about to snap shut. These ordinary people, with ordinary jobs and ordinary paychecks, suddenly had leverage into the stock market that they never would have had otherwise. They weren't investing in businesses they understood. They weren't analyzing balance sheets or diving deep into management teams. They weren't reading financial statements or thinking about dividends. They were simply betting. Betting that the stock price would be higher tomorrow than it was today. Pure speculation. And as long as new money kept pouring in from other speculators, as long as the wave kept building, the prices did go higher. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy, a collective hallucination where reality no longer applied. Stock prices had more than tripled in the 1920s. Think about what that means. The dividend yields on many stocks, the actual cash profit the company paid you for owning it, had fallen below what you could get from a simple savings account. You could put your money in a bank and get a guaranteed 3 or 4%, or you could buy a stock on margin, putting up 10% of the money yourself, and the stock was yielding less than 3%. In other words, the stocks were worth less as actual productive assets than they would be in pure cash. But prices kept rising anyway. The system was now completely unhinged from reality. The trap was set. But surely the experts saw the truth, right? Surely someone in power would pull the emergency brake. The warnings were real. They just didn't matter. Professional economists warned that valuations had become completely unhinged. There were whispers in financial circles about a correction coming. But whispers weren't louder than the sound of money being made. People were getting rich, or at least they felt like they were getting rich, and that's all that mattered. Money managers who suggested caution, who advised selling stocks and taking profits, were fired by clients who thought they were idiots, fools standing in the way of their fortunes. This is the dangerous moment in every bubble, the critical inflection point. It's when skepticism looks like cowardice, when prudence looks like stupidity, when the people who see the danger are pushed to the margins because they're standing between other people and their dreams of wealth. Even the Federal Reserve, the one institution with the power to slow it all down, faced a terrible dilemma. They could raise interest rates, making money more expensive and choking off the speculation. But doing so would also risk choking off the real economic boom, throwing people out of work, possibly triggering the recession everyone feared. Or they could keep rates low and let the bubble inflate even further until it inevitably popped on its own, possibly with even more damage. They chose the second path. It seemed like the safer option at the time. Throughout the late 1920s, money was cheap. Interest rates were low. Credit was abundant. and the speculation fed on that abundance like a fire fed on oxygen, consuming it, demanding more, requiring endless fuel to keep burning. By the summer of 1929, the bubble had grown so enormous that even the people participating in it were starting to feel uneasy. Something didn't feel right anymore. Margin debt, that borrowed money, had reached astronomical levels. We're talking about hundreds of billions in today's money, an amount so large that any significant drop in prices would cause a cascading default throughout the entire financial system. The cracks were becoming harder to ignore. In late September, auto sales started to slow noticeably. Factory production was declining. The real economy was showing signs of fatigue. But the stock market was still rising, completely disconnected from these warning signs. It was as if two separate economies existed, one grounded in reality and one existing purely in people's collective imagination. The disconnect became so obvious that everyone could see it, but nobody acted on it, because acting on it meant admitting you were wrong, and admitting you were wrong meant taking losses. Then came the voices of authority, telling everyone what they desperately wanted to hear. In early September, the famous economist Irving Fisher, one of the most respected minds in the country, said something stunning. Stock prices, he declared, have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. 2 days later, the market had its first major sell-off of the year. People panicked. They started selling. But then it rallied. It bounced right back. This was a crucial, fatal moment. The system survived the first shock, and when that happens, confidence is actually reinforced rather than broken. People didn't learn from the September dip. They learned the wrong lesson. They learned that they could panic, sell, and then just buy back in at a lower price and recover their losses. What nobody seemed to fully grasp was the interconnectedness of the system. The stock market didn't exist in isolation. It was woven into everything. Banks held stocks. The value of those stocks affected the bank's balance sheets. If stock prices fell far enough, banks would face massive losses. If banks faced losses, they couldn't lend. If they couldn't lend, businesses couldn't operate. If businesses couldn't operate, people lost jobs. Ordinary people had their life savings in those banks. If the banks failed, the savings evaporated. The entire financial system was built on a foundation of assumptions about future profit that had become detached from reality. Nobody wanted to think about what would happen if the assumptions were wrong. It was more profitable to believe they weren't. The trap was set. The warnings had been ignored. The system was now balanced on a knife's edge. And it all came apart in 5 days. October 1929 started like any other week, but it wasn't. Monday, the 21st, was a significant down day. The market fell nearly 3%. People were nervous, but not panicked. The Fed and major bankers held press conferences. They issued statements saying the situation was under control. They called it a healthy correction. When you're on a sinking ship and the captain says it's under control, you don't immediately jump overboard. You wait. You trust the leadership. Tuesday, the 22nd, brought more selling. Wednesday, the 23rd, brought even more. The selling was accelerating, building momentum. Then came Thursday, October 24th, Black Thursday. The selling became frenzied. This wasn't a correction anymore. This was panic. People stopped caring about the price. They just wanted to get out. Just get out. Brokers couldn't handle the volume of sell orders. The system was clogged, overwhelmed. Phone lines were jammed with desperate calls. And the ticker machines, the machines that printed stock prices, they couldn't keep up. They fell hours behind. Imagine this. You sell your stocks, your entire life savings, and then you have to wait hours to find out what price you sold at. By the time you found out, the price could have dropped another 10, 20%. On Black Thursday, nearly 13 million shares changed hands, more than double the typical volume. The system was breaking under its own weight. That weekend was supposed to be a time for relief, for people to think clearly. Instead, it was a time of pure, cold terror, because that's when the margin calls started arriving. Telegrams of doom. This is the sound of the trap snapping shut. A margin call is when your broker tells you, the stocks you bought with my money are falling. You need to put more money into your account right now, or I will sell all your stocks immediately to cover my loan. No negotiation, no mercy. But if your stocks are already dropping, where do you get more money? You don't. You can't. So the broker sells them anyway at whatever price they can get. This flood of forced selling pushes prices down even further. Each drop triggers more margin calls. Each new round of margin calls triggers more forced selling. The virtuous cycle that had built up prices for years now worked in reverse, with terrifying speed. Everyone could feel something had fundamentally broken. You didn't need to be an economist. If Thursday had been that bad, Monday would be worse, much worse. There was no mechanism to stop it, no circuit breaker, no pause button. The buying power had evaporated. The margin loans were being called in, and most importantly, confidence, the magic belief that held the entire fantasy together, had cracked. And when confidence breaks, it doesn't come back. Monday, October 28, 1929, Black Monday. This was the day the system came apart completely. Prices didn't just fall, they collapsed. The market dropped nearly 13% in a single day. People lost fortunes they thought were permanent. Brokerage firms that had seemed like monuments of the financial establishment faced insolvency. In those final hours of trading, there was pure panic, chaos, terror. The stock ticker machines ran until 7:08 p.m. that evening, just trying to catch up with the volume of trades. The system was so overwhelmed, it took hours for the ticker to process what had happened. By the time prices printed, they were already obsolete, hours old, meaningless. The disconnect between the printed price and the actual price was like watching your wealth evaporate in a slow-motion disaster film where you are powerless to stop it. And then, as if that wasn't enough, came Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday. The market fell another 12%. The system was dead. The people who had bought on margin, the ordinary people who had mortgaged their future to participate in the boom, faced total annihilation. This is the part that is hard to understand today. This is the soul of the story. A man with $10,000 in stocks bought with $1,000 of his own money on margin. He didn't just lose his $1,000. He lost his $1,000 and owed the broker $9,000 more. You could go from thinking you were wealthy to being catastrophically in debt all in one afternoon. The brokerage firms started failing almost immediately. The banks that had financed the margin loans started taking massive losses. The cascade of failure spread outward in all directions, touching everything. What people didn't fully understand in those first few days was that this wasn't just a stock market crash. This was the beginning of a chain reaction that would destroy the entire economy. Banks failed because their assets were gone. Businesses couldn't get credit. Workers got laid off. Families lost their homes. The optimism of the 1920s, the belief that the future would always be better, that you could get rich quick, that the party would never end, evaporated. What replaced it was fear. Pure, corrosive, paralyzing fear. Fear that made people hoard cash. Fear that made them withdraw their bank deposits, causing even healthy banks to fail. Fear that destroyed the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. The Great Depression that followed lasted over a decade. Unemployment reached 25%. Entire industries shrank to almost nothing. The optimism of the 1920s turned into the despair of the 1930s. We asked at the beginning if the warnings were ignored. The truth is worse. They weren't just ignored, they were punished. The people who tried to sound the alarm were dismissed as fools. The sound of money being made was louder than the voice of caution. The key insight from 1929 is that financial systems are fragile when they're built on confidence rather than on reality. When what things are worth depends primarily on what people think they're worth, rather than on their actual productive capacity, the system becomes vulnerable. And confidence can shift in an instant. The 1929 crash created the rules and regulations that governed our financial system for 80 years, until many of them were dismantled, leading directly to another crisis in 2008. History showed, as it always does, that the story of get rich quick was wrong. The tragedy isn't that people were fooled. The tragedy is that this same story gets told again and again in different bubbles and different eras. People keep believing it because the incentives remain the same. The 1929 crash was not an inevitable disaster. It was a predictable consequence of a society that was willing to believe comfortable lies rather than confront uncomfortable truths. The signs were all there. The pattern is repeating. The question is, are we listening this time?